Folks, I found one very ridiculous, ignorant statement that was made last week that I decided I wanted to do a video on. And this statement, it came from Rachel Maddow. Now, Rachel Maddow, if you know who she is, you'll know she's not an actress. She doesn't work in Hollywood in any kind of way. She's not in the entertainment industry. She's on MSNBC. She's a news person. She's some political commentator or whatever the hell her title is. And me, I talk about entertainment. I don't really talk about politics, but I do talk about how entertainment has been quite politicized. Now, Rachel Maddow, she's some political commentator, but she made some comments on Lord of the Rings last week that I want to talk about. Alright, so to start off, let's just play what she said.
Like Mr. Teal, who has named his companies after things in the Lord of the Rings series of J.R.R. Tolkien books. Lord of the Rings is a sort of favorite cosmos for naming things and cultural references for a lot of far-right and alt-right figures, both in Europe and the United States. Peter Thiel names all these things after Tolkien figures and places, like his company Palantir, for example. Like his mentor, like Peter Thiel, who had given him all his jobs in the world, Mr. Vance also, when he founded his own venture capital firm, with help from Peter Thiel, named it after a Lord of the Rings thing. He called it Narya, N-A-R-Y-A, which you can remember because it's Aryan, but you move the N to the front. Apparently that word has something to do with elves and rings from the Lord of the Rings series. I don't know.
Alright, so essentially, she's commenting on how apparently a bunch of quote-unquote far-right or alt-right individuals like Lord of the Rings. She's insinuating that Lord of the Rings fans are quote-unquote far-right. I wanted to make a video on this because number one, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and number two, this is not the first time that we've seen this sort of claim, and I'll show you a few headlines in just a bit. But basically, Trump's running mate J.D. Vance, I guess he's a big Lord of the Rings fan, and I guess some friend of his or mentor, some billionaire guy, I guess he's also a fan of Lord of the Rings. But the very last comment that Maddow made here, where she said he or J.D. Vance called it, or his company, Narya, N-A-R-Y-A, which you can remember because it's Aryan, but you move the N to the front. Apparently that word has something to do with elves and rings from Lord of the Rings series, I don't know, she says. And that comment that Rachel Maddow made was extremely ignorant. It was extremely idiotic. Now first she's saying J.D. Vance's company is Narya, and it's Aryan with the N moved to the end. Basically she's insinuating that J.D. Vance is a certain word that rhymes with Yahtzee but with an N at the front. And I would make the argument, and I think a lot of people out there would agree with me, that that type of rhetoric is exactly what led to a certain pretty big event happening last week. But really, if you think about it, I mean, Tolkien himself came up with that word. So that statement Rachel Maddow made saying Narya is Aryan but with the N moved to the end, she's really insinuating that Tolkien himself is a Yahtzee. And Narya, it's just one of the elven rings. Now, if any of you have actually read any of Tolkien's letters, which Rachel Maddow clearly has not, and if you know anything about Tolkien himself, he fought in World War I, he lived through World War II. He was actually alive at the time of the Yahtzees, which Rachel Maddow was not. Tolkien actually wrote letters to some of the Yahtzees. And what did he say? Well, they were asking about translating The Hobbit into German, but they were asking him about if he had any Jewish blood in him. And what did Tolkien write back? Here we have a quote from one of his letters. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. He also says your inquiry is doubtless made in order to comply with the laws of your own country, but that this should be held to apply to the subjects of another state would be improper, even if it had, as it has not, any bearing whatsoever on the merits of my work or its sustainability for publication, of which you appear to have satisfied yourselves without reference to my abstemum. Here's another quote that Tolkien made on the Yahtzees, or the leader of the Yahtzees. I have in this war a burning private grudge against that ruddy little ignoramus, the guy leading Germany in the 1930s and early 40s, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. So, Rachel Maddow, saying Narya is Aryan with the letter N moved to the back. Whether she knows it or not, she's insinuating that Tolkien is a Yahtzee. And if so, then she is what word did Tolkien use? A ruddy little ignoramus. But one reason why I wanted to make this video is because this comment Rachel Maddow made, it's not the first time in recent years that people on the left or people in the woke crowd have tried to liken Lord of the Rings fans to the bad guys of World War II. Here at CBC, how the Lord of the Rings became a symbol for Italy's far right, and this is from just last year. We had this article from 2 years ago from Den of Geek, Lord of the Rings of Power, Why Fandom Has to Embrace Change. And I'll read you just one big paragraph from this article. Lord of the Rings has already been co-opted by the far right. And by the way, before I go any further, folks, no, the bad guys in World War II were not far right. That's a lie that the left has been telling for years, but I'll continue. Despite Tolkien being on record as hating apartheid, British and American imperialism in the Far East, raging against Yazidis and their interpretation of his work as an Aryan allegory, he was asked by German publishers in 1938, yeah, I already read you that stuff. This has continued to be the case. In 1970s Italy, there were Hobbit summer camps run by a burgeoning right-wing movement who marketed themselves as not your father's bad guys from World War II. A sense of traditionalism of restoring the apparently glorious past drove them and connected them to Tolkien's work, and unfortunately for Tolkien, there are parallels to be made. Fans of Tolkien include Gianluca Casseri and Anders Breivik, both racially motivated life-enders, Varg Vikernes, a black metal musician, life-ender, and anti-Semite and scientific racist, i.e. someone who misapplies science to support their racism. So here in this article, they're likening Lord of the Rings fans to mass life-enders, who happen to also be Lord of the Rings fans. And as Lord of the Rings fans have been wrongly getting called far-right and being compared to bad guys from World War II, you've been seeing a real push over the last few years, right after Christopher Tolkien passed away, to make Tolkien's work woke, make Lord of the Rings woke to current-day Lord of the Rings, to quote-unquote update Lord of the Rings for modern audiences. A few years back, the Tolkien Society had some seminars. One of them was called Gondor in Transition, a brief introduction to transgender realities in the Lord of the Rings, and another one was called Pardoning Saruman, the queer in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And as we started to see woke activists put their fingerprints on Tolkien's work, fans were rightly criticizing all of it. And the reaction from the woke crowd, there's a couple different angles that they've taken. On one hand, some of them will try to claim that Tolkien was always woke. Here from 3 years ago, the OneRing.net. Listen, we've been dealing with homophobic comments for decades and it's still wrong. Whatever toxic arguments are being said now about Lord of the Rings fandom and adaptations is the same trash that said Ian McKellen was the worst affront to Tolkien's legacy ever. Which, Ian McKellen, he's gay in real life. Okay, I don't remember anybody criticizing the casting of Ian McKellen as Gandalf, but I see you're trying to form a narrative here. And here's another statement from the OneRing.net. If you still think Ian McKellen is the worst and that Catholic Tolkien would have never approved, I beg you to read more of Tolkien's books and letters. He was woke, stood against hate, and embraced all cultures in life and fiction. It's why his books are translated in every language. So yeah, when Lord of the Rings fans are rightly criticizing the fact that Lord of the Rings is getting woke, people in the woke crowd, they try to convince us that Tolkien was always woke, which no, he was not. And the OneRing.net says Tolkien stood against hate, embraced all cultures in life and fiction, and that's why his books are translated into every language. I always thought they were translated into every language because his stories are universally loved by everybody. And then here's the other angle that people in that crowd will take. And all the activists that are perverting Lord of the Rings, I think this much more accurately describes what they think. This article is from Screen Rant, and this is from 4 years ago. This is before The Rings of Power came out. Lord of the Rings, lack of diversity, and 9 other problems with the series. And the person's talking about both the books and the movies, but let's see what problems this person has with Lord of the Rings. Okay, first, Sam is essentially Frodo's servant. But then I go through some of the other reasons. Here we have a lot of the characters are sexist. Given that the books were written in the 50s, they were published in the 50s. I don't know if I'd say written. I think Tolkien started them in the 40s, but it's not surprising that it presents views on gender that seem really outdated today. While in some instances characters such as Eowyn go against gender roles in interesting ways, there's also a lot of sexism. Many characters, including her brother Eomer, express views that place women in very restrictive roles. So in other words, they hate Lord of the Rings because the characters in Lord of the Rings are following traditional gender roles. Which, so what? What's wrong with that? Look, blunt truth, whether you like hearing this or not, men are stronger than women. On average. And because of that, wars are always going to be fought by men, predominantly by men. It's always been that way, it's always going to be that way. Here's another one. Arwen gives up her immortality for a man. And they make the comment, while Arwen and Aragorn are considered by many fans to be quite romantic, they are the main romantic relationship from the movies especially. There are some troubling dynamics at play here. What are these troubling dynamics? For Arwen to be with Aragorn, she has to accept that she will give up her immortal life as an elf. She is willing to do this, and she seems to have no other real goals in life except to be with him. It's definitely a bit reductive and not the healthiest approach to a relationship. So she wants to be with Aragorn when she should be trying to be a strong woman girl boss queen. Essentially, this is another reason why they hate Lord of the Rings. The woke crowd, it consists of feminists, and their view is that women wanting to do anything for a man, or if a woman's source of happiness comes from a man in any kind of way, that's toxic, that's problematic. Something is wrong with that woman. You get the idea. Next, using fantasy races as a metaphor for real race relations. And then we have this one, the existence of orcs. And they write the very existence of orcs in the series, especially given how the legacy of orcs has been used, has some issues. They are presented as a race of beings that is purely evil, and they are given no autonomy or choice. They are seen as purely monsters, and the words used to describe them are pretty loaded when you dissect them. And there's this one claim out there, this one really ignorant, idiotic claim that orcs are a metaphor for black people, which the word orc comes from Old English orkneus, a word that appears in line 112 of the poem Beowulf. It also comes from the Latin word orcus, and the words are translating essentially as evil demons, evil devils, evil phantoms. You know, the translations can vary, but it's always something evil, it's always something demonic. The orcs weren't exactly human in Lord of the Rings, they were more monster, they were more demon. And this is a fantasy story. I mean, you can have a certain creature or whatever be evil. It's fiction. Next, there isn't any LGBT plus representation. You're missing the word Q in there. And they comment, once again, this seems to be something that's a major reflection of the time period in which J.R.R. Tolkien lived, but even the movies didn't do anything to change this. Well, why should they change it if there aren't any such characters in the story? If you're adapting the story, you want to adapt it accurately. In fact, even though the Hobbit trilogy was released as movies not that long ago, none of the films include any LGBT plus characters even on a side level. It seems like the filmmakers had a real chance to include more diversity in the story, as they did change and add many things and even characters, so it's a shame this didn't happen. Even just as a side moment, especially considering the series cast many LGBT plus actors, this would have been great to see. It wouldn't have been accurate to the story though, and this is a very telltale sign that the people writing these articles are not actual fans. When they talk about adaptations, they're not concerned at all with being accurate to the story. They're concerned with checking boxes off, whatever those boxes might be, whether it be more female characters, whether it be LGBT plus characters, whether it be more diversity. They're more concerned about modernizing it. They're more concerned about making changes to the story, which if they really are fans, why would they want to change it? If the people working in Hollywood, if the people working on Amazon really are Lord of the Rings fans, then why do they want to change Tolkien's lore so much? Simple common sense question. And then next, there are no female characters, and right under this headline is a female character. And then the Haradrim people is full of harmful stereotypes. And then finally, there aren't really any characters of color. And again, this article came out before Rings of Power came out. This article's from 2020. And they write, the biggest issue with The Lord of the Rings is that there are no characters of color who get named except for one. While a few of the orcs and extras were played by people of color, none of the other characters are of any other race other than white. So the reason why it didn't have people of color in there, the reason why Lord of the Rings wasn't very diverse is because Lord of the Rings is based on European mythology, it's based on European folklore. Tolkien explicitly stated that Lord of the Rings was meant as a mythology for England. The Greek mythologies survived through the years, the Norse mythologies, the Eddas survived through the years, Finland's epic, the Kalevala, survived through the years, but England's mythology was destroyed thanks to William the Conqueror during the Norman invasion. This was something Tolkien lamented, and he wanted to create a mythology for his home country of England. But because this is based on European mythology and folklore, the context is, yeah, it's gonna be a bunch of white people in there. People in the woke crowd might say it doesn't matter, it's just a fictional story. The question I would have for them is, if Disney in their live-action adaptation for Aladdin cast a white guy as Aladdin and a white girl as Jasmine, do you think that crowd would have the same opinion, or do you think they would be rioting at Disneyland? If Marvel cast a white guy as Black Panther, do you think they would say, oh, it's just a fictional story, it doesn't matter? Or do you think they'd be rioting over that? I mean, look, that's the mythology Lord of the Rings is based on. You don't have to like it if you don't want to, but if you don't like it, you are more than free to write your own story, and you can have whatever you want in there. But Lord of the Rings, yes, it's not very diverse by today's standards. It is old-fashioned, but you know what? That old-fashioned story has millions and millions and millions of fans. And they love that story despite the fact that it's old-fashioned. That story, with all its traditional gender roles and lack of female characters and whatever else, it has a huge fan base. And they love that story just the way it is. So if you're going to be making an adaptation for this Amazon, you might want to stick to the original story or the original lore. Otherwise the fans are going to rightly criticize you. And look, Lord of the Rings fans and fans in general, none of us have a problem with diversity by itself, but there are some instances where it does not make sense. Lord of the Rings is one of those cases. And I get that you think Lord of the Rings is outdated, I get that you want to quote-unquote update it for modern audiences, but the fact of the matter is it's not your story. You did not write it, and therefore you don't have the right to change it. Period. This article, it's from 4 years ago. It came out before Rings of Power came out, but I think this sums up what the woke crowd, what the people at Amazon actually think of Lord of the Rings. They think it's problematic, they think it's outdated. Yes, you will have some people on that side of the spectrum claiming that Tolkien is woke and was always woke, but then you have other people on that side of things saying that Tolkien is problematic and he's outdated and he's a bigot, things like that. Which, okay people, make your minds up on what argument you want to make here. You can't have it both ways here. But really, if you ask me, I think the people in the woke crowd, their true opinion is that Lord of the Rings is toxic, it's problematic, it's outdated, and so they want to change it. And they view a lot of Lord of the Rings fans as being far right or whatever buzz phrase they use. Make no mistake, these people, whether it be Rachel Maddow, whether it be the people at Amazon, they do not like Lord of the Rings fans. For that matter, they don't like Star Wars fans either, or fans of any other franchise out there. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.